Hello everyone. Today we are going to learn about memoization in React in order to prevent the unnecessary re-renders that happen and which makes the app slower if the component is pretty large. So as you can see, we have the app component here. And to demonstrate this example, there will be two child components to app, counter1 and counter2. Now, we'll be creating the state variable and the handlers respectively inside the app.js. So let's import useState. So useState, and now whenever a component renders, it produces a log in the terminal if you try to console log that particular component. So here we want to see if that is true. So we're writing console.log app component re-rendering. And now we should be seeing it in the terminal below in the code sandbox. Yeah, so you can see that is happening. Similarly, we'll be using the use to create the counter variables for counter1 and counter2. So C1 and set C1. C1 will be passed to counter1 component when we create it. Let's do the same for counter2, and setting the value as 2 for counter2. Now we'll have to first create counter1 and 2 respectively. So let's start by creating counter1. So we'll be importing React. So we have a fragment, and inside that we'll create a normal uh, div. Yeah, and let's write counter1 for now, and let's export this component as default. So similarly, you might also need to do the same for counter2. And let's say the props that are being passed are also being shown on the component. So we'll say props.c1 because we are passing c1 to counter1 component. Now we'll copy the same code for counter2. So let's copy, Control A, Control C, go to counter2, paste, and we'll just rename to counter2 and counter2 respectively, and C2. Now we need to import those two components. So we have imported counter1 and counter2 components. So we'll try to import them here. So let's write counter1 and counter2. Now we need to pass the parameters. So we'll say c1 is equal to c1, and similarly say c2 is equal to c2. There seems to be some error. Okay. So yeah, I have renamed it incorrectly. So yeah, we can see the counter 1 and 2 components respectively. Now we need to have a way to use set C1 and set C2. So we will create a normal uh, span, and the feature we are trying to build here is if we try to hover over this individual span tags, so it will trigger the handlers that will change the values for counter 1 and counter 2. So let's just say left for the component associated with counter 1 and right for the component associated with counter 2. Now we want the change to be triggered when hover happens. So we will say on mouse over. Yeah, I spelled it correctly. And now we will say handle left. Similarly, we want to say on mouse over and handle right. So let's copy that and paste it here. Now spell it handle right. Please bear with me. Everything will be free from bugs in a while. So we'll say handle left equals an arrow function. Yeah, pat arrow function. Copy the same and say handle right equals handle right. Yeah. Now we need to use the set C1 and set C2 respectively. So set C1 should be C1 plus 1 whenever it is hovered. Similarly, set C2 should be C2 plus 1 when it is hovered. Um, it's showing those squiggly lines. Okay. Yeah, right. I have missed the const keyword. That's the reason. Const. Yeah. Now, if we try to hover over the left and the right component respectively, we should be able to see a change in the values. So both the components are rendering as expected, and we can also see app component rendering text appearing, the number of times the components or the children have re-rendered. So what we are going to do is we are going to change and let the child components say the same. Has component 1 rendering, or rather counter 1 rendering. And we'll paste the same here to say counter 2 rendering, so that whenever this component renders, this log should get printed. Let's refresh. Now if we hover over left, we see that the count is updating correctly, but if you notice, when we hover over right, counter 1 rendering is also getting printed, which should not be the case because the value that has not changed, so it should not have re-rendered. This is the place where React.memo should come into picture, and the way we implement it is by wrapping React.memo around the component that is getting exported. Now let's see the difference. If we try to hover over left, we see that the right component, or rather counter to component, does not re-render. Now we are wrapping React.memo on counter 1. We expect to see a similar result where it should not re-render if the other component is getting hovered. So as we can see, if we hover over left hand side component, only counter 1's value changes, and only the logs associated with counter 1 are getting printed. Similarly, on the right hand side, so React.memo helps us to avoid unnecessary re-renders when one of the sibling component is getting re-rendered, and it does so by tracking the end props, whether or not they have changed. If they have not changed, then React is going to use a memoized version of the code.